The result had been visible for years before the journal appeared. People had already seen the speed, the restraint, the certainty in movement. What no one had seen was how quietly it was built. When a close friend finally opened the notebook, there was no sense of revelation, only recognition. The pages did not explain Bruce Lee's mastery. They confirmed that it had been inevitable. The notebook did not announce itself when it appeared. There was no sense of discovery, no urgency attached to it. It surfaced the way personal objects often do, quietly, through familiarity rather than intention. It belonged to Bruce Lee during a period when his public image was beginning to solidify, but his private life remained largely unexamined. Those who knew him well understood that he separated these two worlds deliberately. What he showed others was functional. What he kept for himself was precise. The friend who came across the journal had known him outside of training halls and film sets, not as a figure to be studied, but as a person navigating long days, shared meals, and ordinary routines. The notebook was not locked away. It was not hidden. It simply sat among other personal effects, unmarked and unremarkable. At first glance, it did not resemble a manual. There were no diagrams, no dramatic language, no emphasis on achievement. The handwriting was compact, almost restrained, as if written to conserve space rather than to explain. Dates appeared inconsistently. Some pages were filled, others were left partially blank. What struck the reader immediately was the absence of intention to teach. This was not something meant to be shared. It was not framed for clarity or persuasion. The entries assumed understanding. They were reminders, not instructions. Those closest to Bruce Lee later said this made sense. He had little patience for performative discipline. He trained to resolve questions, not to document effort. The journal reflected that same approach. It did not track progress in the way others might expect. It recorded decisions. The friend did not read the notebook in one sitting. It was returned several times over days, sometimes weeks. Each time the impression deepened rather than expanded. There was no hidden revelation waiting on the final page. The meaning of the journal came from repetition, not of words, but of restraint. The most surprising element was its modest scope. The routine outline did not dominate the day. It occupied a fixed, contained space within it. 20 minutes appeared again and again, noted without emphasis, as if its sufficiency required no defense. There was no commentary explaining why this duration mattered, no justification for its limits. The notebook assumed that attention, applied fully, did not benefit from excess. It suggested that discipline was not measured by how much one endured, but by how consistently one returned. When asked later why he had never mentioned the journal, Bruce Lee reportedly dismissed the question, not defensively, but without interest. To him, it had served its purpose. It was a private structure, not a statement. Those who read the pages did not feel inspired in the conventional sense. They felt confronted. The notebook offered no spectacle to admire, no intensity to imitate. It simply existed as evidence of a choice made repeatedly over time. And that, more than any specific entry, is what unsettled the reader most. The journal was not a window into ambition. It was a record of acceptance, of limits, of focus, of a routine that did not seek validation. By the time the notebook was closed again, it was clear why it had remained unnoticed for so long. It was never meant to explain Bruce Lee. It only supported what his actions had already made visible. The journal did not emerge from a period of comfort. It was written during years when Bruce Lee's days were divided, crowded, and often unpredictable. Those who were close to him remembered how little of his time was fully his own. Teaching, travel, study, work, all competed for space. Privacy was limited. Consistency was not guaranteed. He trained wherever he could. Small rooms, borrowed spaces, quiet corners of shared environments. There was rarely a sense of permanence. Equipment changed, surfaces changed, schedules changed. What remained stable was his insistence on returning to the same internal structure, regardless of where the body happened to be. The journal reflects this instability without ever mentioning it directly. There are no complaints about fatigue, no references to inconvenience. Instead, the pages suggest an acceptance of constraint. The routine was shaped to survive disruption. It did not rely on ideal conditions. It assumed interruption as normal. Those who observed Bruce Lee during this period noticed how little he spoke about training volume. He did not compare hours. He did not debate endurance. When others extended their sessions, he did not follow. When access to space was limited, he did not postpone. He adapted without discussion. The notebook's entries imply this adaptation subtly. The structure remains intact even as circumstances shift around it. There is no evidence of expansion in response to stress, no attempt to compensate for missed time. The routine does not grow larger when pressure increases, it becomes sharper. This approach surprised some of the people who later read the journal. Many had assumed that Bruce Lee's development came from relentless accumulation, more repetitions, more strain, more intensity. What they found instead was a refusal to overload. The routine was designed to fit into life, not dominate it. Friends recall that he guarded this time carefully, not dramatically but firmly. He did not announce that he was training, he simply disappeared briefly and returned unchanged in demeanor. The 20 minutes were not treated as special. They were treated as necessary. This restraint extended beyond physical practice. The journal hints at mental preparation carried out under the same limitations. Focus was applied in short, complete intervals. Attention was trained the way movement was trained, deliberately, without excess. There is no indication that Bruce Lee viewed these constraints as obstacles. If anything, they appear to have sharpened his discipline. The routine was not built despite limited conditions, it was built because of them. By shaping his training to survive real life, he removed dependence on ideal circumstances. What remained was something portable, repeatable, and resilient. And over time, that quiet resilience became visible to everyone else. What the journal did not contain was as instructive as what it did. There were no margins filled with affirmations, no language aimed at pushing through resistance, no evidence of training as a performance, even to oneself. The authority in the pages came from their refusal to persuade. Those who expected intensity to be documented, exhaustion, strain, emotional peaks, found none of it. The entries were neutral in tone, almost administrative. Movements were noted without commentary. Sequences appeared without explanation. The absence of emphasis suggested that nothing written there required justification. This restraint mirrored how Bruce Lee carried himself publicly during the same years. Witnesses often remarked on how little he needed to assert. He did not correct others unless necessary. He did not frame his ideas as challenges. When questioned, he answered briefly, sometimes incompletely, as if trusting the listener to do the remaining work. The journal reflected that same trust. It assumed competence. It assumed responsibility. Anyone reading it without preparation would find it insufficient. That insufficiency was not accidental. It filtered the audience. In training spaces, this quality translated into an unusual dynamic. Bruce Lee did not arrive to dominate. He observed. He adjusted. He waited. When demonstrations occurred, they were brief and unembellished. He did not repeat them for effect. The authority he carried came not from visibility, but from consistency. The journal suggests that this consistency was deliberate. Each entry reinforces the same pattern: limited scope, precise focus, controlled execution. There is no variation meant to impress, no expansion meant to display progress. Authority in this framework is not accumulated, it is maintained. Those who later encountered Bruce Lee for the first time often described a subtle disorientation. They expected intensity and found calm. They expected a display and found an absence. This mismatch unsettled some and reassured others. The journal explains why. He had trained himself to function without signaling. In a culture that often equated effort with visibility, this approach stood apart. Bruce Lee did not externalize his discipline. He internalized it. The routine existed to remove uncertainty, not to create narrative. Several readers of the journal admitted to feeling exposed by it, not because it criticized them, but because it offered no refuge in complexity. There was nothing to admire from a distance, only something to either do or avoid. That quiet pressure, the kind that does not demand response but still elicits one, was present both in the pages and in the man. Authority without display creates its own tension. It invites comparison without initiating it. By the time readers reached the later entries, they understood that the journal was not documenting growth. It was documenting alignment between intention, action, and restraint. And alignment, once established, does not need to announce itself. The routine, when read carefully, did not unfold like a program. There was no sense of progression from beginner to advanced, no escalation designed to impress a future reader. It existed as a closed system, complete, contained, and unconcerned with external validation. What appeared on the page were short entries, economical in language and scope. Movements were referenced without flourish. Sequences were implied rather than explained. There was no effort to catalog everything that could be done, only what needed to be done. Those who later studied the journal noticed how the structure resisted interpretation as ambition. The routine did not expand over time. It did not multiply. It returned. Again and again, it returned to the same framework. The 20 minutes were not treated as a minimum to be exceeded, but as a boundary to be respected. This boundary was intentional. The routine was designed to sharpen attention, not exhaust the body. Each segment had a purpose, but none overstayed it. There was no redundancy. If something appeared repeatedly, it was because it continued to matter, not because it was familiar. Witnesses who trained alongside Bruce Lee during this period recalled how quickly he disengaged once his practice was complete. There was no lingering, no attempt to add extra work for reassurance. He finished, rested briefly, and moved on. The discipline did not spill into the rest of the day. It supported it. The journal reflects this containment. There are no notes about pushing through, no entries that suggest compensating for missed sessions. If time was lost, it was lost. The routine resumed the next day without penalty. This refusal to negotiate with guilt preserved the integrity of the practice. The structure itself emphasized transition over repetition. Movements flowed into one another without interruption. There was little emphasis on isolation. Everything served connection, balance, timing, alignment. Even conditioning was framed as preparation rather than achievement. What many readers found most unsettling was how unspecific the routine appeared to be. It offered no clear target for comparison, no metrics, no thresholds. This ambiguity forced readers to confront their own dependence on measurement. Bruce Lee had removed spectacle from the routine by removing the audience, even the imagined one. The journal was not a stage, it was a tool. And like all effective tools, it was shaped to disappear in use. Those who expected the routine to explain his capabilities found themselves disappointed. Those who paid attention realized it explained something more durable, how he maintained readiness without strain, clarity without excess. By the end of the chapter, the routine no longer felt minimal, it felt exact. And in that exactness, readers began to understand why nothing in Bruce Lee's public presence ever felt improvised, even when it appeared spontaneous. The reaction to the journal was rarely voiced aloud. Those who read it did not gather to discuss it, nor did they quote it with enthusiasm. Instead, the effect appeared later, in altered behavior, shortened sessions, quieter preparation, longer pauses before action. What unsettled experienced practitioners most was not the routine itself, but what it implied about their own habits. Many had built identities around endurance, accumulation, and visible effort. The journal offered none of these as reassurance. It did not criticize them. It simply ignored their assumptions. Several readers admitted privately to an initial disappointment. They had expected complexity. They had expected insight that could be extracted and adopted quickly. What they encountered instead was a structure that demanded ownership. Nothing in the pages could be borrowed without commitment. This created a subtle psychological pressure. The journal did not challenge others directly, yet it exposed how often training was used to postpone decision-making. Excess had masked uncertainty. Length had replaced clarity. The 20-minute boundary removed those shelters. Those who attempted to follow the routine found it uncomfortable in unexpected ways. Not physically, but mentally. Without volume to lean on, attention became unavoidable. Distractions surfaced quickly. Weaknesses appeared sooner. There was no room to hide behind effort. Bruce Lee never presented the journal as a standard for others. In fact, he seemed indifferent to whether anyone followed it. That indifference was part of its force. The routine existed independently of approval. It neither invited imitation nor resisted it. Witnesses later recalled how this attitude mirrored his behavior in shared training spaces. He did not compare progress. He did not measure himself against others. When asked for advice, he responded minimally, often redirecting the question back to the individual. The journal functioned the same way. It reflected responsibility rather than offering instruction. Over time, the journal began to act as a quiet filter. Those drawn to spectacle lost interest quickly. Those drawn to control lingered. The absence of dramatic payoff discouraged casual engagement. What remained was a smaller group, attentive and patient. For some, the experience was humbling. They recognized how much of their training had been performative, even when done alone. The journal offered no applause, no narrative arc. It asked only for consistency and restraint. The challenge it presented was never stated, but it was unmistakable. If mastery could be built this quietly, what exactly had everyone else been doing? That question, once introduced, did not require reinforcement. It stayed with those who encountered the pages, reshaping their relationship with effort long after the notebook had been closed. And that silent reshaping was perhaps the journal's most deliberate function. For those who had trained with Bruce Lee, the journal did not reveal anything new. It clarified what they had already observed without fully understanding. In public settings, informal challenges, shared training sessions, brief demonstrations, his behavior followed the same pattern found in the notebook. He did not warm up for long periods. He did not escalate to meet expectations. He arrived prepared, as if nothing needed to be added in the moment. Witnesses often remarked on how little he adjusted before engagement. While others stretched, tested range, or repeated movements for reassurance, Bruce Lee remained still. When action occurred, it did not look hurried or forced. It appeared placed, as though it belonged exactly where it landed. Those who later read the journal recognized this quality immediately. The routine had trained him to enter situations already resolved internally. The 20 minutes were not about building capacity for the unknown. They were about removing hesitation when the known appeared. In several remembered encounters, observers noted that his demonstrations ended before they fully registered as demonstrations. There was no sequence to analyze, no performance to replay. The interaction concluded, and Bruce Lee disengaged. He did not wait for a reaction. He did not frame what had happened. He simply returned to stillness. This consistency between private discipline and public behavior unsettled people more than overt dominance would have. It suggested that there was no separation between training and application. The routine had not prepared him for moments of pressure, it had normalized them. Those who faced him directly often described a brief but disorienting sensation. Not fear, but displacement. Their expectations did not align with what occurred. Timing felt unfamiliar, distance collapsed sooner than anticipated, the moment resolved before interpretation could begin. The journal explained why. By limiting duration and scope, Bruce Lee had trained attention rather than endurance. His body responded without negotiation. His decisions did not compete with fatigue or doubt. They emerged intact. Importantly, these public moments were never pursued as evidence. Bruce Lee did not recount them later. He did not preserve them through repetition. Each remained isolated, complete on its own terms. The journal reinforced this containment. It did not prepare him to prove himself repeatedly, it prepared him to finish once. Over time, observers began to associate his calm with inevitability, not because he appeared threatening, but because nothing about him suggested urgency. He did not need the moment to confirm anything. The routine had already done that work in private. For those who later connected these observations back to the journal, the relationship became unmistakable. What appeared effortless in public had been made deliberate elsewhere. The absence of spectacle was not accidental. It was trained. And once that connection was understood, Bruce Lee's public presence no longer seemed mysterious. It seemed accounted for. Years passed before the journal was spoken of again, and even then, only briefly. It never became a reference text. It was not circulated. It did not enter public discussion in any meaningful way. For most people, it simply disappeared back into private memory, where it had always belonged. Bruce Lee's legacy, meanwhile, expanded far beyond the quiet routines that had shaped it. Films, interviews, stories of challenges and demonstrations, these became the visible record. Yet those who had seen the notebook, or heard about it firsthand, carried a different understanding beneath the surface of those images. They noticed how little contradiction existed between the man on screen and the man in small rooms. The precision, the restraint, the absence of excess, none of it appeared suddenly. It had been rehearsed in obscurity, protected from interruption by its modest scale. After Bruce Lee's death, the journal took on a different weight, not as a relic, but as a counterpoint. At a time when his image risked becoming exaggerated, the notebook quietly resisted myth-making. It did not support grand narratives. It reduced them. Those who reflected on it years later often described a sense of recalibration. The journal did not diminish his achievements. It grounded them. It suggested that what endured was not extraordinary effort, but sustained attention applied without drama. Instructors who had heard of the routine sometimes referenced it obliquely, not as something to copy, but as an example of what serious work could look like when stripped of display. They spoke of limits, of choosing enough rather than more, of finishing before fatigue introduced noise. The journal itself remained unchanged by time. Its entries did not gain clarity with distance. They did not become more impressive. If anything, they became quieter. As the legend around Bruce Lee grew louder, the notebook receded further into contrast. This contrast proved instructive for those willing to sit with it. It suggested that mastery does not require constant expansion, that identity does not need reinforcement, that the most durable practices are often the least visible. In the end, the journal did not explain Bruce Lee's impact. It explained its texture. It showed how a man who appeared effortless in moments of pressure had built that ease deliberately, within constraints, without witnesses. It revealed that his confidence was not maintained by repetition of success, but by repetition of preparation. When the pages were finally closed for the last time, nothing felt unfinished. The routine had already done its work. It had shaped a way of moving through the world that did not depend on recognition. What remained was not a method to be preserved, but a standard to be understood, one that continued to surface quietly wherever restraint was valued over display. And in that silence, the legacy held.